Broadcasting live and worldwide. Here's Brody Brazil.
All the time is nigh for the San Jose Sharks. If you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe spend some time later and look it up in a Google search. Also include the name Erik Karlsson to that. It would just be a poor start on my part if that's how I began this YouTube video, if that's how I began this podcast. But I really do feel like that is a theme for the San Jose Sharks in their final 18 games of the regular season and into the second season. The time truly is nigh or now for them. I can't recall a better built roster for the second season, a deeper team than the one we're witnessing right now. And they're not perfect. And we'll get into all that in just a second, some of their deficiencies and things to worry about and watch. Clearly, this is what sports is all about. You're rarely ever going to have a masterpiece from start to finish. There are stories of the season, and I'll share with you what I'm watching regarding the Sharks. But as for San Jose, I mean, really, they started off this season with probably the biggest trade of the entire NHL campaign, acquiring Erik Karlsson from Ottawa, and just, about 14, 15 hours before the deadline, they also ended it quite nicely, the window of transaction opportunities, getting Gus Nyquist from the Detroit Red Wings. And I think what is such a cool Sharks tradition, we saw on Erik Karlsson's Instagram, he went to the airport in Boston to go pick up his fellow Swede, Gus, at the airport. You may recall last year at the deadline, it was Joe Thornton who was hurt. He went to San Jose Airport to pick up Evander Kane, who had just flown into town. So the camaraderie already deep. I'm loving it. And what I want to do here on this podcast and YouTube video is take a lot of your questions and comments. I offered up that opportunity earlier today on Twitter. And I also have some responses from Doug Wilson, some things he said today during his media availability, which I think are so relevant, so worthy of including here. So I actually want to begin with this first tweet from Paul saying, "Many are still concerned with team defense and goaltending, though I believe the stats for goalies are more reflective of the deficiencies of the team's defense. Do you share those concerns, given that Gus doesn't address them, or are we just going to, quote, outscore our issues?" Okay, before I give you my thoughts on that, here's what Doug Wilson said today. The question was posed to him, are you happy with your goaltending? At the same time, do you hope to get just a little bit more out of your goaltending down the stretch? And here's the way that Doug went with the response.
Well, I think it's a collective effort. I mean, when we play well and play the way Pete and our coaches want us to play well, we can play high-scoring games. We can play one-goal games, and we beat some good teams. And I think that's really what we're looking forward to. Is I think our best hockey is ahead of us. I think historically our guys have shown that, and I think now we have a lot of different ingredients that Pete can put in different roles at different times, and can play when you're up a goal, down a goal. I think getting adjusted to having this additional offensive threats that we have is a good thing, but make no mistake about it, we're still a blue-collar team that needs to play a certain way when we don't have the puck, and I don't have any doubt we'll get back to that.
I think that's it right there. I mean, they have all of the offensive weapons, but a blue-collar team that still has to play a certain way without the puck. I totally see that. I totally agree with that. I know there was a lot of conversation in the last week, specifically in the last weekend, about the Sharks' goalie situation, and people all of a sudden, and they say it's been a long-standing issue, but all of a sudden they're interested in goalie transactions, acquiring a new goalie, and I'm just not sure what San Jose would have done hypothetically if they would have acquired a guy like Ryan Miller, who, by the way, said he did not want to leave the Ducks. Does that mean that Miller would have stepped ahead of Jones with 18 games left, or is he there to step ahead of Dell and back up Jones and push Jones? It just creates a weird situation this late in the game. Also, if you were the Sharks going out after goaltending, at this point, it's the most expensive point of the season. And you look at the names available, none of them immediately give you a certain better opportunity than what the Sharks already have in Jones and Dell. And my point there is just that there was no name that just pops out and says, that one is instantly better. That is instantly a way to improve your team. Yeah, I know you're going to look at stats and you're going to look deep into the basic stats, the advanced stats on goaltending, but in my opinion, nothing really made sense. But even before we get to that point, let's take a step back and just talk about the Sharks and maybe one thing all of us can agree on this season, whether you were one who wanted, a change in goaltending or not. San Jose is going to go as far as their defense can take them in the last 18 games and in whatever lies beyond that in the postseason. The Sharks clearly, to all of us, were not sound defensively in the first 2 months of this season, and that's why they couldn't win games on a consistent basis. That's why they never racked off 6 and 7 in a row like they did in December and into January when they started to figure out the defensive side of their game. And I think what's crazy about that, last year the Sharks made their mark defensively. They were one of the most sound defensive teams in the league, and goaltending was part of that. Goaltending, to me, and the stats on goalies, especially with the simple stuff like goals against and save percentage, that is directly tied to what team defense provides. In fact, if you look at a goalie's goals against average, realistically, that's telling you how many goals the team allows on an average basis when that particular goalie is in the blue paint. I know it's often seen as an individual stat, but to me, it's not that. And I think when you look at Dell and Jones this year, their stats are below standards, just like the Sharks as a team defensively giving up a lot more goals. Everything is below standards, and they set the bar so high last year that what you're expecting this time around is not being matched. I would also add into there's the factor that league-wide scoring is up to a certain degree. I'm not saying that that's the entire reason for maybe Jones and Dell's numbers being different this season, but that's also a consideration. And the last thing on this is, there was all this chatter about maybe a change in goaltending here late in the season, again, with about less than 25% of the schedule still to come in the regular season. And I feel like a lot of this was very similar to when we were back in late November, and there was conversations on social media about firing Pete DeBoer. At the time, I didn't even address it because I thought those were so far-fetched and unreasonable, and look what the team did in December and into January, and I don't think there's anybody right now. You just look at their results so far in the calendar year of 2019. I don't think there's a lot of people that are upset with how this team has performed big picture, and Pete DeBoer and the coaching staff are a large part of that. Now, it's not to say that the coaching staff didn't make changes. They did. They assigned a couple coaches to different and new roles. They just shuffled the deck a little bit, and they got the results that they were probably looking for. So again, I hope we're past a lot of that goalie conversation. We have to be now. This is the way the Sharks are set down the stretch and into the playoffs with Jones and Dell. I feel quite confident about them as individually as well as in tandem. And I really do feel like, you're trying to build, a Stanley Cup winning team, but you realize that you can't necessarily handpick how you want this to go. You can't. There's a salary cap here. Everything has to fit into a competitive team structure. And if you're telling me that, are there other goalies with higher numbers this year? Absolutely, they're out there. But those teams are hanging on to those guys. And as for Jones and Dell, again, I feel like this insults them to have all these conversations. But going back to how I really feel is quite confident with those guys. And I think a lot of the players that skate in front of them on the Sharks would tell you that as well. They would tell you that team defense, and not just the defensemen, we're talking forwards as well, too. Forwards and D-men can all play a more responsible game without the puck. When the Sharks do that, right, when they play good team defense, obviously they're limiting the opponent, but also, as Joe Pavelski even alluded to this weekend, the offensive side of the Sharks game actually goes up. Offense, to a certain degree, fueled by how well San Jose can play defense. So again, as for goaltending, to me, it's a non-factor now. I am looking down the stretch, though, as the biggest point for this team is how well they can play defense. I want to move on here to another tweet, this one from Cyclone. What line do you see Nyquist playing on? The Kane, Hurdle, Donskoy line, or the Sorensen, Jumbo, LeBanc line? Or do you think DeBoer might just mix up the two lines instead? I think you're going to see Nyquist in probably a couple different situations here down the stretch. And why wouldn't you? If you're Pete DeBoer, you don't want him to just settle in right away and stick with two other guys and that's it. Because in the playoffs, if you have to make changes, he's never skated with other players. So I think to a certain degree, you actually want him to get a taste of a couple different lines. I'll read another tweet here from NTQ. Do you think Nyquist will fit better with Thornton and LeBanc or Hurdle and Kane? To me, where I would start Nyquist would be on the Joe Thornton, Marcus Sorensen line. Now, we don't know the health status as I record this right now of Sorensen, who was recently, over the weekend, hit in the face with a puck. But I feel like two things about this. If you could eventually get Nyquist, by the way, I should say, Gus is how he prefers to be called. So anybody that's still on Gustav, Gus Nyquist. If you're one of the cool kids, you'll call him Gus. Gus, I'm laughing, by the way, on the YouTube video. I know you can't see that on the podcast. Gus, I think, is the best fit right off the bat with Joe Thornton and Marcus Sorensen. Who wouldn't want to skate with Jumbo fresh off of joining the team? All right, let's move on to this. Another key point for the Sharks here down the stretch is their diversity in scoring. And I know we talk about this a lot. With the addition of Nyquist, the Sharks now have 11 different goal scorers in double-digit totals. I mean, that is amazing. And they're going to get a couple more here pretty soon. They have a couple more that are close to that 10 mark. But the Sharks, as it stands right now, also have 9 40-point players. And again, this is with 18 games left. So more damage is going to be done, especially down the stretch. Gus Nyquist is obviously part of that. And just going back to the earlier question of Nyquist not addressing maybe some of the defensive issues that the team has or has had this season. Again, it's not like they're not capable of playing good defense. We've seen stretches where they are tremendous and hardly give up anything. It's just being a consistent, great defensive team. But Nyquist this season, in addition to almost approaching 50 points, I think he's like a -1 or maybe 2, which, yeah, doesn't sound terrific, but he's also been playing with the Red Wings, who don't win a ton of games this season and do, let up a fair amount of goals. So the fact that he's almost an even player with that team, I think, says a lot. And actually, I want to take it back to one other thing I missed in terms of, what line you might see Gus playing on to begin with and what type of player the Sharks hope they're getting. Here's what Doug Wilson said about that today.
To find a top six forward that's really versatile, plays the game the way he does. I mean, got speed and he sees the game at a great in a great way. That was an ingredient that we identified would be nice to add. I think you watched this game yesterday. I mean, not that was the final viewing or decision, but I think he had 8 shots, but he made things happen every time he was out on the ice. So, we felt that a guy like him, you'd have to give a certain price. And the thing for us was we didn't want to give up any players off our roster. We didn't want to give any of our younger players, our top prospects that are close to playing. So we took that into consideration when went after Gus.
Yeah, so Gus, obviously a guy that just scored against San Jose the other night. I mean, they saw what he did in person, but the point being is why is this so important? Because you get into the playoffs and defense is usually what wins games and what wins series. I think we've all experienced that with the Sharks even in the last handful of years and decades. But to have such a diverse scoring effort, you're not relying on the 1, 2, or 3 players that are typically finding the back of the net. If you're San Jose and you have a list of 10 different guys who are threats with the puck, I mean, you're just in so much of a better space to avoid, what the playoffs can sometimes be all about. You go into a scoring rut and your series and your season, coincidentally, are done. And it just seems like, again, the scoring is going to be there for the Sharks. This all takes it back to that whole issue of team defense. If the team defense is there, you got a good feeling that the offense has been there all season. Adding Nyquist only helps that. And again, I don't think he's a bad defensive player at all. He's probably a pretty solid defensive player. We'll find out here. We'll see how he fits in with this San Jose team. Moving on to another topic here. It does seem like potential first-round playoff opponents for the Sharks this time around are actually a little bit limited. When I say that, in years past, you would throw all these teams I'll mention here, then you would throw them out there. You would also put in Los Angeles and Anaheim. The Kings and Ducks, for the first time in a long time, are not going to be around in the second season. And was that about 10, 12 years ago that you would say that was the last time that neither of those clubs were in it with San Jose for contention? So it's a little bit different that San Jose right now and Calgary and Las Vegas are the top three in the Pacific. And that's pretty much it in that division. It seems like the Central Division right now is going to send both wildcard teams, and whether it's Dallas or Minnesota or the Avs, there's about 5 teams, all those 5 I've mentioned there, the Flames, Golden Knights, Stars, Wild, and Avs. Those are the teams it looks like the Sharks might face in the first round. Now, again, what's after that? I don't even know if it's worth discussing yet. I mean, who knows how the bracket works on the other side and who gets eliminated and who you face, and you never want to wish for certain opponents. All you can really do here down the stretch is maybe project a little bit as to what the first round might bring. It might bring something incredibly difficult like Calgary or Las Vegas. We know those are both formidable opponents for San Jose. That's a tough first round. Think about that. One of those two teams, if it's the Sharks and Golden Knights, one of those two great potential cup-winning teams is out after the first round. It's just the way the Western Conference works, and I'll get to how all the trades seem to benefit Western teams in just a second. I know there's a Twitter question on that. It's crazy. It feels like the East is just giving everything away. I know not everything completely away, but a lot of Western teams definitely benefiting, Winnipeg and Nashville included, as well as the Sharks. So it's weird. It's weird when you look ahead at the playoffs for San Jose. Less of a bigger group this year of potential first-round opponents, but definitely challenging ones, and there's a lot to be sorted out. And that brings me to another point I want to make here about what is most important for the Sharks in their final 18 games. And it's Erik Karlsson. It's his health. It's his groin. And we're going to say this a lot on TV. It's catchy. I wish we didn't have to say it. But do you rest it or do you test it? And I think I have a soundbite here from Doug Wilson. Yes, I do. Here's what he updated us today. Again, this is February 25th. Earlier today from Boston, here's what he said about the status of Erik Karlsson.
As far as his injury, he had a little minor tweak. I think on the heels of him having been out for a while, I just wanted to make sure everything was in a good place. He's day-to-day. He's going to be fine. The one thing we've done is, with how we've played and performed, we have the luxury of building a little bit of space between some of the teams below us. Obviously, we're in a race with Calgary and Vegas, but I think we can take a little extra time and rest him and make sure it's 100% before he comes back, which is what our intention is going to be. But he is going to be fine going forward.
Yeah, it's good to hear Doug put it that way. But again, they need him in the playoffs. He is such a key part of this team defensively and offensively, and the groin is such a tricky thing. I believe it's Karlsson's first time dealing with this specific injury. He already missed a handful of games, came back, and now has retweaked the injury. So it's one of those things, like Doug mentions there, the Sharks have built themselves such a pad in the Pacific Division. And the question is, as I go back to that playoff matchup thing, would you sacrifice the Sharks not winning the division if it meant Erik Karlsson was 101% healthy going into the playoffs? For me, absolutely. Absolutely. And you think about, the Sharks still in the 2 seed would have home ice advantage in round 1, but sometimes the playoff matchups don't make a lot of sense. We've seen an 8 seed come out of the West and appear in the Stanley Cup final. We've seen the 1 seed exit after, 4 or 5 game series in the first round. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. You can't sit here and wish for a certain opponent or a certain situation. All you can and should wish for is that your star players are healthy. And again, the Karlsson thing is, I don't want to say concerning, but it is of a high level of interest to me here down the stretch, and how the Sharks and Karlsson are able to get number 65 right. Let's move on to some more Twitter questions here. Trevor asking, is San Jose the Swedish equivalent to Detroit in the late 90s for Russians? It does kind of seem like that right now when you've got two Carlsons, a Sorensen, and now you have a Nyquist. Not to mention behind the scenes, you got my buddy Crankshaft, Douglas Murray, still working for the team. So, no, I it's crazy how that works out. And I know some people are already thinking, does all of this and Nyquist and Carlson, being friends prior, does this help the Sharks hang on to Carlson? Does this help the chances of the Sharks keeping Nyquist for any certain period of time? I don't know that Nyquist is a long-term projection, and I believe there's a Twitter question about that on here, so maybe I'll save that. But to me, this is pure rental at this point, but who knows? It's nice that there are some friendly options seemingly in place. Another question here from Trevor, and I'll take this one. Which GM has the best track record in the week leading up to the trade deadline? Is it Doug Wilson? I'll say this. In the last couple years, it's definitely Doug Wilson. Over time, that would be a difficult question to answer. You'd really have to put in a lot of research, and quite honestly, I'm lazy and it's late right now. But I just do want to point out that Doug Wilson in the last couple years, he's always made moves, and in retrospect, so many of them have made sense. It's not to say that Doug's tenure has been perfect, and it's not to say that maybe there was a rough patch of acquisitions that didn't work out for Wilson for, a handful of months or years. But as of late, if you're going to look at a general manager almost like an athlete in their trends and their highs and their lows, Doug Wilson in the last couple years here has been on a roll. It has been impressive. Check my Instagram for a little something I cooked up, the screenshot of an iPhone with Doug calling on it. That is not what I don't think a lot of GMs want to see that with, 24, 48 hours left on the deadline, because he has just pulled off some moves that even teams that have nothing to do with it and fans that have nothing to do with the Sharks are like, wow, Doug Wilson pulled that off? How did he do it? So quite the dealer is Doug Wilson, especially in the later hours. Let's move on to a couple more Twitter questions here. Alden asking, seems like there was some tire kicking on Joakim Ryan. Was Wilson really willing to part with him, or was this one-sided on the part of the other teams? I really don't know, Alden, but I'll tell you what makes sense to me. And all of this, by the way, is a full compliment to Joakim Ryan. Other teams are interested in him. They know that San Jose has a surplus of very good defensemen, especially of the younger variety. Tim Heed included in that. And heck, you could even say Dylan DeMello. That's something that the Ottawa Senators wanted. And the Sharks had even more of an excess of that at one point to be able to bring in Erik Karlsson. So I think the Sharks were listening. How serious were they? Don't know. Couldn't tell you. But the fact that they were listening, why wouldn't you? You have a commodity. Other teams want it. The Sharks are down a couple draft picks because of the way they were able to get Nyquist with 2 draft picks going to the Red Wings. So, if something made sense, a lot of sense, if it was an offer too good to pass up, sure, I think San Jose might have gone with that. But they also recognize Joakim Ryan is a valuable commodity, and if it doesn't make sense right now, there is absolutely no rush to unload him somewhere else. How about this one from Jason here? Simmons to Nashville and Stone to the Golden Knights. And that's what I'm talking about, like the East totally just giving stuff away between Ottawa and Philly, giving it away to the Western teams and making it tougher for the Sharks in their Western playoff bracket to get to the Stanley Cup final. It's weird how that happens. And like I said before, I know some players went from West to East too, so it wasn't completely one-sided, but it just seems like all of the biggest deals we saw in the last 48 hours were all players coming West. To answer the obvious question, does this all make it more difficult for San Jose? Of course. You don't think the Golden Knights are stoked to get Stone? And apparently they want to sign him to a long-term deal. And Wayne Simmons in Nashville, that seems like an obvious rental situation. But the Preds get that much deeper, and a player like Simmons out front of the opposition net, and you obviously have a player like PK Subban on the blue line getting pucks through. That's a dangerous combination. That's similar to what the Sharks have with Brent Burns and Joe Pavelski out front. You get the shot through and you get somebody right out front to cash in on it, maybe on a rebound or a second chance or some loose change. So look, both those teams also got significantly better. That's why it was important for the Sharks to do the same. I also want to cover my butt on something. I said all along, if the Sharks made no moves, I would have been happy. That still holds true. I would have been happy if there was no YouTube video and podcast about getting Gus Nyquist. But there is, so I'm even happier. It's as simple as that. How about this one from David? Do you think it's conceivable that the Sharks can afford Karlsson, Nyquist, and Pavelski next season, given how well Pavelski is playing this year? I see Nyquist as a rental, but you never know. David, I also need to and want to throw in the name Timo Meier. There's a couple others that'll also need new contracts, but Timo Meier a part of that conversation as well. I think what your last words were there is the most accurate. You never know. Clearly, you want Pavelski back. And yeah, his value might have gone up this season now as he has, 36 goals and counting, 35 or 6? I lost count the other day. I think it's 35. Again, it's late. But you're talking about Pavelski, who's going to definitely, flirt with 40, if not, hopefully, fingers crossed, surpass a 40-goal season. And he's the captain. And you traded for Karlsson, and you want to make sure you can button him down. By the way, any day now, after this 25th of February, Karlsson can sign the maximum 8-year contract with the Sharks. According to a Pierre LeBrun report I saw today, that's not going to be an immediate thing. That's fine. You know what? What's the rush? Doug Wilson just got done with the trade deadline, and now Erik Karlsson wants to focus on getting healthy in the playoffs. They have until July 1st to figure something out. All right, so there's plenty of time on that one. Does it indicate that something wasn't already worked out and a handshake was already done and they can just mail in the paperwork today? Yeah, I guess it does mean that something wasn't done. But to think that they're completely far off, I don't think is accurate either. Oh, on that note, here's one from Zach. Do you see anything imminent with an Erik Karlsson extension? See my prior answer. Actually, Zach, that's my fault because I laid out these Twitter questions and I forgot to read ahead and see yours there. But no, I think if you're Karlsson right now, right? Playoffs, new team, rough season for you, rough start, injury, nagging injury. You want to get the on-ice stuff right. And as much as it's his agent's job to lock all that stuff away, you kind of just want to, it'll be nice. It'd be nice the day that, Karlsson and the Sharks can have a big old press conference and work it out, and then hopefully, dominoes fall, and then they can re-sign Pavelski and Timo Meier. But it's not number one right now for Erik Karlsson. And from a fan perspective, I would hope you'd understand that too. And I'm not speaking for Erik. Maybe it is a top priority. But I'm saying that if he's not making it a priority right now, you could easily see why. All right, let's get to the last Twitter question here from Alex, who asks, what has been your favorite Sharks acquisition since you've been in the Bay covering the team? Well, Alex, to be honest with you, it's been 10 years now. I can't believe it that I've covered the Sharks for NBC, CSN, Comcast Sportsnet, but I go way back further than that, and I cannot exactly claim 91, 92. I didn't get to go to a game at the Cow Palace, but obviously, I grew up in the Bay Area. I've done all my television work here in the Bay Area. I've been a Sharks fan since 93 is when I'll say. I went to my first game at San Jose Arena, fell in love with it ever since then. But to say favorite acquisition, and this is a hard question because you think about some of your favorite players over the years, the Patrick Marleaus, the Logan Coutures, the Joe Pavelskis, the Marc-Edouard Vlasics, those are all homegrown players. So they're not acquisitions in any sense. I'm looking for outside players coming in. And how do you not just say Joe Thornton is number one? He changed the face of this franchise. He made them, a legitimate contender. And it's not to say that with Patty or Owen Nolan before that, they weren't. I'm just saying that all of a sudden you add, a future Hall of Famer, and people looked at the Sharks a lot differently as soon as they had Jumbo there. But not too far away from Jumbo. Erik Karlsson, when they got him back in September, that was a huge deal. Think about the expectations and the excitement level of the players. I was there on September 13th when they made that deal. You should have seen how these guys were looking. I mean, it was crazy. They just lost a couple teammates they liked, but like the next day when it all sunk in, I mean, it truly changed the dynamics of the Sharks going into this season. I would also say even Evander Kane last year. Doug Wilson has been on a roll these last couple of years with especially trade deadline acquisitions. But there have been others, and Dan Boyle over the years. I do want to point this one out because I feel like it's not going to be on everybody's radar, but to me it was an interesting study. I really liked the year that the Sharks, was it 2013, when they got Raffi Torres. Because, and I know it didn't end out well with Raffi and the knee injury and the suspension and in the playoffs, but man, I remember when the Sharks traded for Raffi, and just on social media alone, Twitter wasn't as big back then, but there was like an outcry of angry Sharks fans, and they didn't want this guy on their team, and this is not the kind of the team that they wanted to be, and all that stuff. And I defended Raffi. I knew at the time, watch, this is the kind of player you've been missing. You need this kind of player. Sure enough, and I know he only played, less than 20 games that season, and then got suspended in the Kings series for that hit on Jared Stoll. But the fact that everybody had Raffi's back during that suspension, which I still think was ridiculous, it was so cool to see a fan base go from, I don't even know if we want that guy, to, we got this guy's back. I thought that was fun to watch. All right, so there you have it. 18 games left for the San Jose Sharks. Again, going back to what I said at the beginning of this video and this podcast, it's been a long time. It's been maybe forever since the Sharks have had a roster this deep with this much promise. And it's not to say that they've been a perfect team this season. Definitely they haven't been. There are areas for improvement, but that's a great thing. We can see what they are. We can see what this team needs to do. It's on them to execute. And hopefully that is exactly what happens. I appreciate you watching this YouTube video or downloading the podcast. You can also obviously check me out on Twitter during the games. I'm very active there, as well as on Instagram. Been putting up a lot of content I hope you have enjoyed as of late. And also here on my YouTube channel, really been trying to crank out some different stuff here for your enjoyment. But as for this episode, I really appreciate you watching and listening. And until next time, I'm Brody Brazil. And yes, that is my real name.